Okay, so we're rounding. This is the last session of the day. I think all of you know this is a fireside chat with former Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. I'm going to make a quick introduction. He's going to be moderated in conversation today by Gerry Baker, who is editor-at-large at the Wall Street Journal. His weekly column for the editorial page, Free Expression, appears in the Wall Street Journal each Tuesday. Please welcome Gerry Baker and Secretary Ross.
You. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, Wilbur, as you heard, this is billed as a fireside chat, but as far as I can tell from the schedule, we are the only thing standing between these good people and a cocktail hour.
Well, and I'm glad we don't have a real fire.
So we'll try to make it lively and stimulating, but not so gloomy given the current economic environment that everybody goes off to cocktails in desperate need of a drink.
Okay.
But look, you've had an extraordinarily long and successful career in investing and, of course, in government, most recently as Secretary of Commerce in the Trump administration. So you're very well placed to give a perspective on these macro and economic and financial trends that we've been talking about here today and that we're going to talk about in the next half an hour. So let me start, if I may, with you with the topic that's, I think, on top of everybody's mind, which is the economic outlook. The U.S. economy seems to be continue to grow. There's contradictory signals on this. Obviously, we had negative GDP growth in the first two quarters, very slightly, but the labor market seems in reasonably good shape. Consumer spending is still continuing. And yet, of course, we're all dealing with these remarkable financial developments, obviously financial markets itself, and of course, above all, the Federal Reserve aggressively raising interest rates, and according to Jay Powell, the chairman, set to do quite a lot more. So where do you stand on where the U.S. economy in particular is right now? I saw Jamie Dimon yesterday saying he thought a recession was likely in the next 6 to 9 months. Do you think the Federal Reserve can pull off this attempt to suppress inflationary pressures without tipping the economy into recession?
My best guess is we're in for a protracted period of stagflation. And I don't think it matters whether it exactly tips into a recession by 1 or 2% or goes a little bit above and is a little bit positive. It's going to be basically flat economy for some time to come. Inflation, I think, is a lot to the economy like what an infection is to the human body. If you deal with it quickly when it shows its first signs, very easy to get rid of it. Very simple medication does it. When you let the infection grow and fester for a long time, it gets hard. And sometimes the curative impact also has bad side effects. I think that's what we're going into here by analogy with the body. But is it Armageddon? Is it a Great Depression? No, I don't think so. I just think it's going to be very soggy, but very inflationary. And the reason I think the inflation will be so hard to get rid of is we should really look at the components and think each one which is going to be strong in terms of inflationary pressure, which is not. I think to paint with a very broad brush and just say this is what inflation will be is really not the right mindset for looking at it. As you know, 32% of the CPI is shelter. Shelter costs are definitely going to go up in the next year or two. There's a lag factor between when prices of real estate go up and when they're reflected, because about a third of the home residents is divided into two categories. The rentals. Well, rentals have been going up at an enormous rate, but most leases are 3 years, so you're only going to start getting the full effect as you get out into next year. And similarly, while the prices of houses probably won't go up very much in the next year or two in general, the impact of the former increases and the fact that some folks still have variable rate mortgages, so their interest rates are going to go up, And property taxes for sure, especially in most urban areas, are also going to go up.
And the labour market still seems tight, right? I mean, again, there's no relieving so far of those pressures. We see the unemployment rate fall again last month. Payroll growth was down a little bit, but with average hourly pay rising at about 5% and core prices rising maybe at 6%, there's still a lot of pressure in the labour market on wages to catch up.
There is, and that will continue. This isn't the first year where real wages have gone down. Real wages have been under pressure for quite a few years. And I think middle-class America is sick and tired of having inflation outpace nominal wage gains. So you're going to see enormous pressure there. You might have noticed today the railroad workers decided apparently to turn down what I thought was an extremely lush contract with the railroad. So God knows what they'll end up with for a new contract.
Where does this leave the Fed? The market again still seems to be thinking Fed funds goes up, another 75 basis points next month, and then another 50 at the end of the year, and then maybe we get to between 4.5 and 5, and the general expectation seems to be that's about as far as we need to go. The Fed thinks it does all that, according to its latest forecasts, with unemployment rising, to 4.5% by the middle of next year. I think all the evidence is, to just go back to our original question, that when the unemployment rate rises by that much in that shorter period of time, that's pretty negative for the economy. That does suggest a pretty sharp recession.
Well, it does. I think a buffer to that, however, is the big gap between available jobs and unemployed people. That's almost as wide as it's ever been. So the first million or so available jobs that go away, nobody's going to be bothered by them. Maybe even a couple million jobs can go away and nobody will be bothered by them. So that, I think, is a big buffer that has not typically been present at this stage in an economic environment. The other thing is labor force participation has been stuck. It's still no better than where it was a couple years before the pandemic occurred. Every percentage point in labor force participation is over 2 million people. So if the participation rate went up just 1 percentage point, that brings a huge amount of new supply of labor.
Do you think the Fed got this badly wrong? Do you think this talk all through last year that inflation was transitory, the failure to raise rates until the beginning of this year, they were still doing quantitative easing until the beginning of this year, even as inflation was hitting 6, 7, 8%, is this going to rank as a really serious historic Fed mistake?
Well, I think one of the problems with the Fed is that it uses obsolete models. And it's a problem with models in general. The problem with all these models is they always make the implicit assumption that tomorrow will be a lot like yesterday. But at inflection points, exactly the reason it's an inflection point is tomorrow turns out to be very different from yesterday. And anybody in his right mind who would think that the same economic recovery that came from prior recessions, which were induced by economic causes, that the same conditions would prevail in this unique recession, which was not caused by the economy. The economy was very, very strong when the pandemic hit. This was caused by an exogenous factor, the pandemic. So what I could never understand is why the Fed didn't understand there would be a very big snapback. And I also didn't understand why the federal government didn't get it. Once you removed the singular cause, there was no reason for the jobs not to come back. And we didn't need the last $1 trillion or so of money coming in. So I think this is a self-induced stagflation that we're going to be going into.
What about markets, and how do you see the markets? No one in this room needs reminding. This has been a terrible year for markets, equities. S&P, US. Just keep to the US for the moment. But S&P down 25% now. The Nasdaq down more than 30. I think my newspaper reported that this has been the worst year for bonds. I mean, unusually at the same time as equities. I think in more than 100 years. We're seeing the 10-year Treasury, back around 4% again. Do you think? I mean, where do you stand? Again, sorry to keep coming back to Jamie Dimon, but Jamie Dimon, I noticed yesterday, in addition to forecasting a recession, said he thinks the equities could have another 20% to fall. Do you think, looking ahead to we've got an earnings season coming up, which is clearly going to be quite challenging. We've got this continuing uncertainty about what the Fed's going to do with interest rates. We've got some of these other uncertainties in financial markets. Are we past the worst yet, or do you think there's more to come?
No, but I think we're getting close to it. The market never discounts the same thing twice. And right now it's discounting bad times. Once bad times really occur, then it will start discounting the recovery to good times. So markets by their nature try to be anticipatory. And sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. But as to Powell and the interest rates, I believe that he does not want to go down. Now here's a bug, clearly from the Federal Reserve.
Or the Chinese. Maybe the Chinese will. But I'm going to get on to China
maybe
soon.
It didn't look Chinese, but anyhow.
I'm sure you've dealt with a few Chinese bugs in your time.
No, their bugs tend to be more electronic.
Yeah, sure.
Anyhow, Powell, having totally blown what he should have done earlier, I think is going to be extremely tempted to overshoot. And I don't think he wants to go down in history as the one Federal Reserve president chairman, who could not solve inflation. If it happens to cause a recession, well, so what? Recessions come every now and again. Been a long time since we had a true economic recession rather than pandemic. I think he can shrug that off from a reputational point of view.
How do you see the financial system, the stability of the financial system? Forgive me for saying this, but you're old enough to have lived through a few financial crises in your time. When you see these dramatic movements, particularly in interest rates, that is often a time that creates distress in financial markets. We've seen a little bit of this in the UK with the dramatic move in gilts in the UK, and the Bank of England having to step in to stabilise and help out some of the pension funds who are a little bit exposed there. The old Warren Buffett saying about, when the tide goes out, we see who's been swimming naked. Do you think we might be in for some of that in the next few weeks and months?
Well, I think the UK situation is a little bit unique in that the policies of the new Prime Minister and the policies of Bank of England were antithetical to each other. And if there's one thing the market hates, it's confusion and uncertainty. Markets can adjust to good things, they can adjust to bad things. They hate to deal with uncertainty. So I think that's a little more even of a self-inflicted wound than what we had here. But remember too, in the sunny days, there were great excesses, tremendous excesses. I have a SPAC, as I guess every living adult American does, and
I thought they'd all got rid of. I thought they'd all gone away now. I thought that was last year's Greenwich Economic Forum story.
At the Milken conference a year and a half ago, I predicted that SPACs would be where people would lose an inordinate amount of money, even though I was doing one. It's not that there's anything wrong with the SPAC concept. It's merely a mechanic. It was abused, and so was the general market. So part of the reason we've had such big declines is prices got to where they never should have been. And so a lot of the correction is not even economically based, it's just the psychology has changed. Because the way markets relate to inflation, for the longest while nobody talks about inflation, nobody cares. Then suddenly one morning everybody woke up and had a simultaneous nightmare and said, oh my God, inflation. And then everybody worries about inflation.
About the dollar, that's obviously causing a lot of distress around the world. A lot of emerging markets getting hit very hard by the strength of the dollar. There have been some calls in some parts of the world for something to be done, as there always is in these circumstances, maybe another Plaza Accord. Do you see this as anything that requires a policy response, or are we just going to have to suck it up?
Well, I think IMF, World Bank, and other such entities are going to do what they always do, which is bail the people out. And I think it's in a way sad that that happens. Not that I would like to destroy the emerging countries, I wouldn't, but we have done nothing, despite all the repeated crises in emerging markets, we have done nothing to reform their behavior. They continue to mismatch their borrowings with their own currency. And any time you're in an inherently unstable, weak currency and you choose to borrow money in dollars, you're looking for trouble. And until we teach those countries that that's a wrong approach, it's going to be the same cycle, same cycle, same cycle. Look at Argentina. I forget how many times they've defaulted, but sure enough, then a new face comes in, new central bank governor, and all of a sudden they're borrowing dollars all over again. So if we don't learn from history, as the wise man said, we will be doomed to repeat it.
Karl Marx, I think, wasn't it? But anyway, he's coming back into fashion too in some parts of the world. What about taking a longer-term view? Do you think that we've seen this extraordinary period since the global financial crisis of extraordinary stimulus from central banks in particular, to some extent from fiscal authorities too, but the Federal Reserve's balance sheet hitting 9 trillion. We've got used to this era of essentially effectively zero interest rates. In fact, in Europe, they've had negative interest rates for quite a lot of the last few years. Is that are we now? Is this what we're seeing now? Is not just a kind of cyclical reaction, but do you see this as maybe a resumption of what we used to think of as kind of financial normality? The days of free money are essentially now over.
Well, I think the days of free money probably are over, but they had to come to an end. There just is no free lunch. It's just not possible. And when you have every major economy operating at budget deficits, how you would think that wouldn't percolate its way through into higher interest rates is just silly.
Let's look at some of the specific issues you dealt with as Commerce Secretary now. Let's talk about international economic and trade environment. Right now, I mean, the Trump administration, I think it's fair to say, was the first U.S. administration to take a pretty radical departure with regard to trade generally in the sort of Cold War, post-Cold War era, but particularly with regard to China. Took a very hard line with China, imposed tariffs on a lot of Chinese goods. It does seem as though the Biden administration came in saying it was going to undo a lot of that and that it was going to look for a more multilateral approach to dealing with China. But in practice, it hasn't. Now, I know the president is still considering whether to lift the tariffs on China, and we're going to maybe hear about that in the next few weeks or so. But do you think that we are now in a fundamental, U.S. China, the two most important economic powers in the world, are now in an out-and-out relationship of confrontation, if you like, of economic, I don't want to get onto the political stuff here, but of economic, of a much, we used to talk about economic partnership, previous administrations talked about partnership. Do you think it's now rivalry and confrontation? How would you characterize the relationship between the two most important countries?
I think the prior administration's characterization of it as a partnership were simply incorrect. It never has been a partnership. China is bound and determined to be the factory floor for the world. They are bound and determined to overtake us. So the idea that this was a cooperative thing is silly. It's just not corresponding to the facts. And I don't blame the Chinese. They've done a wonderful job lifting their people out of poverty into some semblance of middle class. And the job they did, going from 80% rural and 20% urban to being more or less 50-50 in such a few decades, is unparalleled in the world. So it's a great success story, and the only real success story of central planning that I'm aware of. The unfortunate thing is we were by definition had to be the main target of their efforts because we're the big boy on the street. And for example, when President Clinton supported China's accession to the WTO, that might very well have been a good idea, but the way it was done was wrong because he did it under the assumption that if they joined WTO, they would automatically play by the rules. Well, they didn't. And unfortunately, they never built in an enforcement mechanism so that if they didn't play by the rules, they would be punished. That was a grievous error, and one that we're going to pay the price for decades to come.
Now, last Friday, the Biden administration announced new restrictions on chips and semiconductors, trade with China. Is it now in the U.S. interest? Again, it was considered for a long time in the U.S. interest to have a strong, growing Chinese economy. It was great for U.S. business. It was great for U.S. exports. It was great for investment. Is it now actually now, do you think, in this era of new competition, is it in the U.S. interest actually to try and keep China down?
Well, I think there are two, as you probably know, I spent a lot of effort during the prior administration campaigning for the CHIPS Act and imposing export restrictions on semiconductor and other high tech for two reasons. One is the economic reason. We right now in the U.S. consume half of all the chips in the world. We only fabricate something like 13%. So we're around 3/4 dependent on imports of chips. Everything from the most simple commodity ones to the most sophisticated ones. That's a terrible point of vulnerability. And the best signal to show how vulnerable it makes you, I believe that a lot of the reason why the Russians weren't able to re-equip their tanks and their planes and everything else is we cut them off from semiconductors, because none of the modern weapons of war work without semiconductors. So that's one. Two, the next war, if there, heaven forbid, is one, I believe is going to be some combination of cyber and space, both of which are extremely dependent on semiconductor. So I think from a national security point of view, as well as from an economic point of view, we cannot be that dependent on foreigners. So I spent literally 2 years, at least a day a week, arguing with Taiwan Semiconductor that they should put their state-of-the-art fab, making the very smallest semi-chips, in Arizona. And they finally did, and we finally gave them the quid pro quo, which was the CHIPS Act. That's really important because they are the world leader in the technology. Close number 2 is Samsung, but in my view, TSMC is the most advanced. Well, we need not just a large quantity of semiconductors, we need to be the leader in the technology, because if we're not, it's going to restrict most other technological advances that we otherwise would make. So I don't like central planning. I don't like countries have industrial policy. But in this case, it was necessary because it wasn't an accident that we became so dependent on the outside. Here's what happened. The chips were invented. Remember back, they used to be called transistors here in the US in the 1960s. But as other countries, China and others, caught on, they decided to subsidize big-time manufacturing of chips. So we're in the peculiar position, we still have the best design capability, but we lack the ability to implement the designs that we make. That's a terrible anomaly.
Is the last 30 years or so, we saw extraordinary growth in globalization, growth of global trade, direct and indirect investment, huge volumes growing at extraordinary rates. But in the last few years, obviously, political pressures, COVID and supply chain disruptions, some of the other changes that we're seeing. Have we passed the high watermark of globalization, do you think?
I think probably so. In fact, one of the many things that the left wing criticized me for when I was in office was saying that I think the advent of COVID will ultimately result in some deindustrialization of China. And it's turning out that that is the case. because when you make these attenuated supply chains where you make it here, you assemble a part there, another part here, another part there, every time you add a point like that, you've added a point of vulnerability. And I think that people, in the quest to save the last 2 pennies, overlook the problem of complexity and the inherent problem of supply chain vulnerability. I think what's happening now is a long overdue correction, and people are saying, well, maybe the last penny isn't worth the fragility that it creates in my business structure.
A quick question on energy. Energy markets, we've seen, I think it's fair to say, the folly of some of the policy making that's been going on around the world, particularly in Europe, but to some extent also in this country, with the disruption in energy markets and the very difficult winter that is likely to be in store. What do you think are the lessons of that? Do you think that how is that affecting governments? How does that affect businesses? How does it? We've just had a panel here on ESG. Do we need to has this been a wake up call for all of those people who've essentially been saying, no, we can, the U.S. can, close down its fossil fuel industries and actually promote sustainable fuel? I mean, what's your overall impression of the implications?
I believe in climate change as a problem, so let me start with that statement. But one has to be careful about the timing of things. It is not rational to think you can get rid of energy from fossil fuels anytime soon. It just isn't going to happen, can't happen. So our policy of being very constrictive on fossil fuels is frankly what has led to a lot of inflation. Gas prices didn't just start going up when Russia invaded Ukraine. Now that exacerbated it, but it surely didn't start there. And now we're in the ridiculous situation. We have this self-created problem here and in Europe, and yet, what are we doing to solve it? We do tokenism things like selling off part of the petroleum reserves, the strategic reserves. We now, apparently, the government is talking with Venezuela, of all places, to ship us oil. Well, if we have complaints about China and their human practices, and we have complaints about Russia, why on earth are we toying with helping Maduro in Venezuela? This is totally crazy. And I think what it demonstrates, if you have one wrong policy, the way to correct it isn't to introduce another wrong policy that creates other problems. All that does is compound the original problem that we had. Further, I think it was very ill-considered that when this administration first came in the very first week, they canceled a lot of armament sales, particularly fighters and air defense systems that our administration was selling to the Saudis and other relatively friendly Arab countries. So what does that lead to? Now, when this administration called the Saudis to help out in oil, how do you think they reacted?
What we saw.
People don't think through that it was the right thing to be concerned about the terrible killing of that journalist, but I don't think the right way to solve that was to create a huge problem, a huge friction for a long time with an essential ally that we need to prevent drastic inflation in fuel prices.
Final question, Secretary Ross, and forgive me for asking you this, but you served obviously in the Trump administration, perhaps we might call it the first Trump administration. I'm wondering, are you expecting the former president seems to be, as far as we can tell, very much intent on running again. Polling suggests he could probably win. Do you expect there to be a second Trump administration after 2024, and will you be a part of it?
You notice he saves the really tricky question till toward the end. That's a great journalistic technique. And I'm going to give the subject's response, which is ducking your question.
But no, I mean, just seriously, would you welcome Donald Trump, a second Trump term?
Well, I think we have 2 years till the next election. A lot of things are going to be different in the next 2 years. Things will be different in terms of the Democratic side. They'll be different in terms of this side. It's too long. It's an eternity to go that far ahead.
You ducked that question as effectively as you've been ducking that fly that's been stalking you throughout the whole of this session. Secretary Wilbur Ross, it was dubbed a fireside chat. We didn't have a fire, but we had plenty of heat and light thanks to your intellectual candle power. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.